Death at Gallows Green. Chapter 48. The game ended. Kings, queens, bishops, knights, and pawns are all pell-melled with great confusion into the box. William Watt, Epistles on the Sins of Gaming, 1711. Standing beside Charles against the wall, Edward scanned the crowd watchful, on his guard. Tom Brock had already been arrested and was sitting with P.C. Bradley, whose handsome face was strained. After today's inquest, Brock would be duly charged and brought to arraignment for his crimes. James Napton sat on the other side of Brock, similarly manacled. Betsy, pale and apprehensive, was seated between her mother and Miss Ardley in front of the coroner's table. The police surgeon was just stepping off the stand, having followed Miss Ardley in the order of testimony. Inspector Wainwright, more nervous and melancholy than usual, was standing at the end of the bar, wearing a weary look, for he had been quite busy in the last few days. Chief Constable Pell was with him, smiling and grand, his blue uniform brushed to a fare-thee-well, his brass buttons shining proudly. Even Inspector Wainwright's Sergeant Battle was among the throng, as were several other carefully chosen men, all watching the proceedings with an air of nervous anticipation. But of them all, only Edward, Charles, and Wainwright knew why they had been summoned. Harry Hodson looked up at Edward and gave an almost imperceptible sign. Edward stepped forward, thinking that he was gladder now of his relationship with the man than he ever had been before. He and Harry had not been boyhood chums, as had he and Artie, nor manhood friends, as he and Charles had grown to be. They were instead acquaintances whose professional relationship was based upon respect and admiration, each for the other's abilities. He had more than once seen Harry handle a difficult courtroom situation where justice and a man's life were suspended between a lie and a half-truth, and had watched him tease out the knot of fact that eventually unraveled the whole story. After Edward and Charles had worked out their theory of the present crime, and the two of them had laid it before Harry, it was only a moment or two before the coroner said in his gruff, blunt way, "Right then, let's get on with it, boys. Dammit, what the deuce are we waiting for?" So now, when Harry summoned him to the witness chair, Edward stepped forward, smartly saluted, and gave his name and rank. Then, in simple language chosen to make the complex matter easier for the jury to understand, he told the story of Todd and Brock and the grain theft, confirmed by the confession taken by P.C. Bradley from the prisoner James Napton, of Artie's discovery of the grain stored in Napton's barn at Highfields Farm, and of his murder there, of the argument at Todd's cottage between Todd and an as of yet unidentified man with whom he was last seen before his death. "It would appear," Edward said in careful summation, "that it was this unidentified man who murdered Russell Todd, or who has at the least withheld from the police material information regarding the cause of his death." There was a stir along the bar, a subtle shifting of space and bodies as men rearranged themselves. A feeling of expectation began to rise in the crowd, as it does when spectators of a chess match sense that checkmate is near, or the audience of a play feels the denouement of draw near. Edward kept his eyes fixed upon Harry Hodson, who straightened the papers on the table before him, and spoke with a judicious frown. "But even if this man were to be identified, Constable Lakin, it would appear that any accusation of him would be entirely circumstantial. Is that not the case?" "Not entirely, sir," Edward said. "There was a witness to the argument, one who can identify the man whom we are seeking." The room quieted, and Edward was suddenly conscious of how stifling it had become. In the front row, Betsy's face was white as paper, her mouth pinched and frightened. Beside her, Agnes clutched the child's hand as if both of them were drowning. Someone at the bar fell suddenly into a fit of coughing and moved a pace or two toward the door to get some air. But several others closed against him, pressing for a better view of the coroner's table, and he was pushed back, still coughing. "A witness," the coroner said musingly. He consulted his papers. "Would that be the child Elizabeth Oliver?" "It would, sir," Edward said. "Thank you, Constable," Harry replied. "You are dismissed." "Call Mistress Elizabeth Oliver," he said to the clerk. The clerk stood beside his stool, raised his tinny voice over the stir of the crowd and the rasping cough of the afflicted man who had made yet another frustrated effort to push his way through the crowd. "Call Mistress Elizabeth Oliver." Edward stood down, and earnest Betsy was sworn and took his place. Her white ruffled pinafore neatly starched over a blue gingham dress, worn black boots carefully buttoned and polished with Edward's own boot black. The coroner smiled in a kindly way over the half-rounds of his gold-rimmed spectacles. "Perhaps it would be best, Mistress Oliver, if you were to tell me what you saw from the beginning. If I am unclear as what you have said, I may interrupt you with a question, but I will endeavor to do that as little as possible." He leaned back and tended his pudgy fingers under a fold of chin. "You may begin." Betsy began in a thin, piping voice to tell the story of her nighttime ratting expedition to Highfield's barn, accompanied by Mr. Brown. "My owl, sir," she explained in answer to the coroner's question. While the crowd listened, riveted by her narration, she related what had happened to her, how she had been suddenly sacked and trussed and tossed into a wagon and later into a mound of hay in the shed, how she had heard the Smith boy proclaim she had her drowned an instant before the constable and Sir Charles Sheridan were about to liberate her, how she had been visited by Jemima Puddledog, whose maternal longings had led her to build a nest in the very same shed, how the sharp-chinned man with copper whiskers had got into an argument with the man with black whiskers, and— "But Mistress Oliver," the coroner objected, "if you were, as you say, bound and gagged and locked into the shed, how was it that you were able to see this black-whiskered man with whom the deceased argued?" "I saw them out the crack," Bessie said. "A large crack or small?" "A dog-sized crack, sir," Bessie said, holding up her hands to demonstrate. A titter ran through the crowd. "The whole Jemima came and went through, you see." "Ah, yes," the coroner said, and hid a smile. "Since you were able to witness this argument through this duck-sized crack, perhaps you can tell us more of the gentleman with whom the deceased argued. He had black whiskers, you say?" "Yes, sir," Betsy said, "and a limp. You see, sir—" "Ah, a limp," said Harry Hodson, with the air of a man who was finally getting somewhere. "What else can you tell me of this black-whiskered man who limped?" The crowd at the bar began to stir. Betsy glanced in the direction of the commotion and bit her lip. The coroner leaned forward. "Don't be afraid, my child. Simply tell me what you saw." "Yes, sir. Well, sir, he limped because he'd got a wooden leg." "A wooden leg!" the coroner exclaimed over the sudden noise of the crowd. He banged his gavel hard. "Silence!" he roared. "There will be order in this court." The crowd quieted somewhat, except for the group at the bar, where there seemed to be some kind of stir. "Mistress Oliver," the coroner said, "please stand on your chair and look out over the courtroom. Tell me if you see that man." The wispy clerk came around the table and gave Betsy his hand. Obediently she climbed up on her chair and looked out over the crowd, and then suddenly pointed. "There he is," she exclaimed, "over by the bar. The man in blue uniform." "That's ridiculous," the man shouted furiously. "She's lying. She's only a child. She's not to be believed." Confusion rumbled like thunder in the courtroom. "Let the record show," the coroner bellowed to the clerk over the din, "that the witness has identified Dudley Pell, Chief Constable of the Essex Constabulary."